Okay, we're right at 11:30, but we have the full committee, and I think other people will be joining as we go. But I want to go ahead and get started because I know Freddie has got several slides, long acknowledgements, and both myself and Dr. Buganza have to leave 11:20, 11:25 to get to class, so, or 1:20, 1:25 to get to class. So thank you all for coming. I apologize, and everybody knows this is the world we live in now, but we have to do this virtually. And Freddie, what would you have bought if we were going to be in person food-wise? What was the spread going to look like?
Donuts, I think,
Okay.
is a pretty good staple. Bagels,
Yeah.
coffee, I think the
The
classics.
works.
Yeah.
Yeah, the works. So you can think about that while we're not eating it, while Freddie's presenting, and hopefully we can still focus on the research then. So we are here today to, yeah, Connor can almost taste the donuts. That's great. To celebrate and work through the defense of Frederick W. Damen, a graduate student in our program. Freddie is a part of the MSDP, MD PhD program. He came to us from Georgia Tech, finishing an engineering degree from Georgia Tech. And it was back in 2013 that Freddie and I first connected. And so I wanted, one of the things I love to do with grad students is look back and see our first communication and see what it was about and what it was like. So I have an email here from February 25th of 2013. So this was pre-Trump, we were way back. I was 2 months out of my postdoc at that point. And Freddie was just interviewing with the second interview for an MSTP slot. And we'd met, I was just getting the lab up and running and was really impressed with Freddie's research experience, his interests, his passions. And Freddie followed up with this email. Dr. Goergen, I hope all has been well with you. I just wanted to send you email letting you know that I had a great time at my second visit, both with the faculty and students in the program, and was very happy that we got a chance to talk. Unfortunately, we didn't get a chance to talk more once we got down to Indianapolis, as I had to join the MSTP candidate schedule. But I've extended an offer to the program. I'd love to talk to you more about possibly doing a rotation in your lab. A real electric cardiac imaging setup in the basement of the welding building. We now, since from the basement, moved up to the third floor and then down to the second. And Freddie's been with us that whole time. He continues, and I'd like to talk to you more about the possibility of constructing a 3D heart contraction model using your ultrasound machine to look at cardiac muscle fiber properties. So not exactly what you did for your thesis, but not that far off, actually. So fairly close. In any case, I'd like to thank you again for taking time out to meet with me, and I hope you'll have a chance to talk more in the future. Regards, Freddie. So that was fantastic. We worked our best to get him an offer, but MSTP is so competitive and there's so limited slots. The ultimate decision was to tell Freddie, we don't have a position for you in the program, but if you'd love to come work with us for 12 months in a gap year, we'd love to get you some research experience and think about it the year after. I was convinced you'd be off somewhere else, but luckily, Freddie took a chance on me, just like we always take chances on students. And it's been great. Ever since then, he started in the summer of 2013 as a research technician, basically research assistant. Applied again, retook the MCAT, was accepted into the program, did 2 years of medical school, and has now been in the PhD program for 5 years and has been an outstanding graduate student. I was trying to think about all the different places we've traveled, things we've done, the papers you've worked on, and it's going to be too much to summarize. So I'm going to let you go through and talk about your research, the aims and how we fit it all together. And then at the end, I'd love for the public portion to be as interactive as possible. So please do think about questions. You can write them in the chat if you'd like, but you're also welcome to unmute and put your camera up. We'll try to limit it to 10 to 15 minutes for the public portion before we have a closed section, ask everybody to sign off except for the committee members, and then we'll wrap up within 2 hours. So with that, Freddie, thank you for your work in the lab. Thank you for everything you've done for the group and for helping to mentor students along the way. And I'm really looking forward to your presentation.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Goergen. It has been a long road, but I've enjoyed every minute of it. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. And so I will say that over the past few days, we've done a lot of testing for this presentation, and I am fingers crossed that we will not run into any technical difficulties, but we have some backup plans just in case. So yeah, so the presentation that I'm going to lay out today is going to go over some of the highlights from the work that I've done over the past 5 years. really in trying to tell a story of my work and where I can see this going potentially in the future. So the work is entitled Spatiotemporal Analysis of Cardiac Disease Using Murine 4-Dimensional Ultrasound. I am a part of the IU Purdue MSTP program, and before I began, obviously Dr. Goergen gave a wonderful introduction, but I'd also like to thank the other members of my committee, Dr. Adrian Buganza, Dr. Jessica Ellis, and Dr. Joseph Rispoli. So with that, so with any realm of research, we really want to start with proper motivation. And for me, it comes down to the cardiovascular system and specifically cardiovascular disease. The heart really acts as this central pump for a systemic system. And what we really can note is that once we get some alterations in terms of the cardiac morphology and functionality, we can really have these systemic effects. And one of the things that I think a lot of us know all too well is that cardiac disease is the leading cause of death in the U.S. And just as some predictions or projections, we can see that by 2030 we could have a 46% increase in incidence, as well as 127% increase in total heart failure costs. So there's both a clinical and a fiscal desire to further understanding this set of disease processes. So with that, we obviously in research we want to take what we see in human disease and apply some unique paradigms. So here we can really start to model human disease within small animal models, and this allows us the ability to control biomolecular mechanisms, different genetic markers, and really get a chance to study disease progression in this controlled environment. And the hope is with that we can translate back to human disease and be able to apply different diagnostic biomarkers, therapeutic targets, and potentially even make lifestyle recommendations. So going back to the heart, one of the staples of cardiac function is looking at the 4 chambers, and specifically the left ventricle is this chamber that pumps the freshly oxygenated blood to the rest of the body. And we want to be able to quantify the cardiac function using a few gold standard metrics. And this is looking at volumes of the left ventricular chamber. We see if we look at end diastolic volume or when it's most filled, and peak systolic volume, where we get the most ejection of blood. We can look at the relationship between the two to get an assessment of its overall functionality. We can look at stroke volume, which is essentially the amount of blood being put out every heartbeat, the ejection fraction or the fractional contractility of the heart, as well as the cardiac output. And specific to some of the work that I'll talk about today, we also look at left ventricular mass, which is an indicator for the size of the actual musculature. And what I'm showing here is a traditional Wiggers diagram. It's essentially plotting out the pressures and volumes of the heart over the course of a couple of cardiac cycles, matched with the electrocardiogram and phonocardiogram. And one of the things that I want to note here is that the traditional paradigm for looking at cardiac disease or monitoring is focusing on the maximum and minimum volumes of the heart chamber. But this really just allows us to monitor disease progression in terms of looking at changes over time. What I'm hoping to do with some of my research is further understand how does the left ventricle fill and inject blood. And by using those types of that information, we want to be able to inform disease progression. And so, with the coming back to the paradigm of being able to use small animal models, one of the things that we can note is if you compare some of the characteristics of both animal models and humans, you can see that there is some differences and it provides some advantages. So what would be 38 to 48 years old in a human is about 10 to 14 months in a mouse. In humans, you would see resting heart rates around 60 to 80 beats per minute, whereas in mice that can go up to 500 to 600 beats per minute. And also, relatively, there's about a tenth the size in terms of the actual heart itself. So, in this smaller, faster heart scenario, what we want to be able to do is apply high frequency ultrasound in order to have routine assessments of cardiac function. You can see here, brightness mode or B mode is one of the most typical methods for looking at the heart kinematics. And one of the ways that we can analyze this is looking at both end diastole and peak systole. And if we wanted to go into a higher temporal resolution, we can pick out just a single transducer element and look at that at a very, very high frame rate. And looking at sort of the changes in the endo and epicardial borders, the inner and outer borders of the myocardium, we can get an assessment for the contractility of the heart. And one of the limitations here really comes down to the fact that since the ultrasound probe is looking at a single line, or should I say plane through the heart, we need to rely on different geometric models of the heart morphology. And while this might be good for hearts that generally have the same shape in a lot of the healthy population, once we start to get to different diseases, this is where we really have to be concerned that these geometric models are failing. And this led to a lot of the early work with four-dimensional ultrasound. And so this is a technique that we worked to develop at the beginning of my PhD. And to sort of lay it out, what we do is we acquire ultrasound images at a very high frame rate. And then using a 3D motor, we can actually translate the probe across the mouse heart and extract out at every relative position in the cardiac cycle a 3D volume of the heart morphometry. And once we piece this back together, we end up having this four-dimensional data set. And with this all laid out, this brings me to my thesis objectives. This is really the crux of the work that I'm going to be laying out today. And specifically, I'm looking here at an iterative approach to research, alternating between development and application for this 4D ultrasound technology. Aim 1 is really going to go into the validation of the 4D ultrasound technique. Aim 2 will look at ways that we can extract metrics out for cardiac function and apply those to better understand cardiac disease progression. Aim 3 will look to see if there's ways that we can expand upon these metrics and apply new novel visualizations of the cardiac cycle. And Aim 4 is going to sort of wrap back around to development and see if we can apply machine learning to further improve the actual analysis process. So specifically focused now on Aim 1. This is some work that began in 2015, but really led into the paper that was published in 2017. So here, you're looking at the gold standard in terms of imaging murine cardiac function with high field cine-MRI. But one of the limitations that you'll note is just due to the way that MR imaging is collected, you really need these thick, what's called slabs of data in order to get enough image quality. That being said, if you look, we really have this unbiased view as to what is actually happening within the left ventricular chamber. Now, if you conversely look at 4D ultrasound, where we have this very high spatial resolution imaging that we can acquire additionally at a very high temporal resolution, we have this nice platform for really looking at left ventricular kinematics. So specifically, the work that we published in 2017 focused on comparing the 4D ultrasound global metrics against that of conventional short axis M mode imaging at the top, or the MRI that we would see at the bottom. And really the part that I want you all to focus on is the nice agreement that we get between 4D ultrasound and MRI. And this really comes from the fact that these are both volumetric imaging approaches that allow us to move past a lot of these geometric models that I had alluded to before. So with this validation work, while not directly a part of that paper, we wanted to use this new validated 4D ultrasound approach to scanning the actual left ventricular kinematics and create a standardized approach for analyzing this data. And this is broken down into the 3 steps: reorientation, boundary tracking as well as, or should I say border tracking as well as boundary tracking. And I'll lay out sort of the examples here. So step one, this is really a powerful tool, I believe, is the ability to reorient the data post-acquisition. So as long as the data, or should I say, as long as the left ventricular anatomy is all captured within the volume, we can actually reorient this to a standard set of axes where the apex and the base of the heart lie perpendicular to the central z-axis. And also we can rotate along that axis to ensure that the papillary muscles sort of lie on the right side of the image, such that the anterior and posterior borders of the wall are on the y-axis and the free wall and septum are on the x-axis. Next, what we want to be able to do is leverage the fact that this is very dynamic data and actually track the translation of the base and apex. And this gives us the ability to not only make initial projections of what the geometry of the heart looks like, but it also allows us to account for through plane motion, which in cardiac imaging is often a limitation. And then finally, we can take these sort of preparations for the data and then apply a standardized grid that can be changed within the z-axis by those bounds that we have tracked. But what you're seeing here is a laid out, very structured subgrid of points where we've got circles that denote the endocardial boundary and X's that denote the epicardial boundary. We also have 4 parallel slices that are equally spaced out between the apex and the base. And we also have 6 different rotations around the left ventricle. And this allows us a paradigm by which we can simplify the problem of boundary tracking to just looking at changes in the radii of any of these given points. And so if we look at this being put into practice, what you see there is on the left is a set of short axis views sort of going through the 4 slices, as well as the 3 rotations around the heart. And what I would hope that you'd be able to see is the fact that we can really capture the local translation of the heart and really get an idea of what the heart is doing throughout the cardiac cycle. And so putting all of this together, the standardized approach that we've developed, we can output this left ventricular mesh, this 4D mesh that allows us to have a very unbiased look at the LV geometry throughout the cardiac cycle. And once we have this mesh, we can take it one step further and actually quantify the motion, where here you're just looking at the total displacement or the amount it's moved at any given point around this mesh. And looking at both the septal or free wall views, you can get an indication of what is normal in the heartbeat. You're looking at a healthy heart right here. And you can see on the septal wall, we don't have as much displacement as we would see on the free wall. And additionally, you get on the free wall this start of contraction towards the base of the heart and a progressive contraction towards the apex, which mimics or reflects the natural stimulation from the AV node down to the apex that we would expect. So with all that said, I hope that we've been able to prove that AIM-1 is achievable with the data that we've provided. And so now if we focus on AIM-2, can 4D ultrasound derived metrics better characterize cardiac disease progression? I will say that this is probably the longest portion of the 4 aims, but it really lays the groundwork for a lot of the future research. And so if we have a disease model that has a genetic predisposition as the one that I'll lay out here, we can really start to look at disease progression as it would normally occur. Specifically, we are focused here on the metabolism of long-chain fatty acids in the mitochondria of cardiomyocytes. So essentially, if we knock out the CPT2 enzyme in these mice, we limit the amount of sources of energy that they can use in order to function. And this really causes issues long-term, where if you are not able to use all of these sources of energy that you would like, you end up getting this progressive hypertrophy or thickening of the myocardium. And, you know, not only do we show here an example for the ultrasound and gross anatomy where we truly have this largening of the chamber as well as hypertrophy in the myocardium. If you actually look at the histology within these two models, you can see a increase in cardiomyocyte size with the genetic knockout. So as the crux of this dissertation revolves around four-dimensional ultrasound imaging, I've laid out here some of the global metrics that we might traditionally find from these 4D meshes. So looking at stroke volume, ejection fraction, end diastolic volume, and left ventricular mass, you're seeing data that was collected over several generations of this cohort. And it gives us some indication based on the numbers as to what's actually happening. The stroke volume doesn't really see much of a change over time, and this makes sense because even though these hearts are diseased, they need to continue to output the proper amount of blood. That being said, we do see a decreased contractility as reflected in the drop-off of ejection fraction. And this is matched in basically how we're able to achieve the maintained stroke volume is through this progressive dilation of the left ventricular chamber. And you know, as a hallmark of this disease, we also see a progressive hypertrophic response of the myocardium. So this heart wall is getting thicker, and the heart is not pumping as efficiently as it should. So you know, if we take a look at this data, we wanted to dive further into it to identify metrics that would allow us to assess the ability for different cardiac measurements to explain the disease, and particularly explain its disease progression. So here we're just focused on two mice, one wild type as you see in blue and one mutant as you see in red. If we just look at the overall trend based on linear regression over time, we can plot out all of the slopes of those data and get an idea of the separation between these based on here we show based on the ejection fraction metric, we can show the separation between the trends in the two groups. And one other way, you know, obviously with this sort of data, we can run something of a traditional, here we do a Mann-Whitney test, basically a non-parametric t-test to identify significance between the two groups. But we also wanted to quantify basically the degree of separation. And the way that we achieve that is using receiver operating characteristic curves, where if you imagine we have a theoretical threshold that we can move across all of our data, we can essentially plot out the sensitivity and specificity or the ability for the test to identify the mutants or wild types from each other. And by calculating an entire area under the curve, this is serving as a metric for how separated are these two groups, and allows us to compare a bunch of the different metrics that we can extract. And just as, you know, obviously there's a lot of information, but just to kind of wrap your head around, an AUC of 1 would essentially indicate that there's no overlap in the values, that the test is going to be perfect depending on whatever value you plug in. So if we go back to these global metrics and run the analysis that I had just outlined, obviously we see a lot of the trends that we would expect, not a significant difference in stroke volume, but the other three metrics do show significance. But what I really want to point to is that ejection fraction has an AUC value of 1, which basically means that if you look at the trends over time, there is no overlap between our wild type mice and our mutants. So this is really a high bar for us to try and match with all the other metrics that we're going to outline. And so with that, you know, obviously I showed some global metrics. One of the hot topics within cardiology is trying to quantify strain. And we can do this by looking at different reference frames within the myocardium. And specifically here, I'm just going to allude to circumferential strain, where you can sort of look at the changes in the circumference of the heart over the course of the cardiac cycle. And so obviously, you know, because these are a contraction, or because the heart is going through a contraction, you're going to have negative values for strain. And at the top left, I outline what is known as linear engineering strain. This is a very general change in overall circumference. But being good engineers, we want to account for the fact that strains over 5% are not properly quantified using the linear definition. So what we do in the circumferential direction is look at green Lagrangian strain, and this allows us to account for the nonlinear components of the deformation within the myocardium. So with these equations, you can see here, there's three different planes by which we can extract out our circumferential strain information. And while the strain curve basically showing the relative change in that circumference over at any point in the cardiac cycle, if we focus here on peak strain or basically the overall relative contractility of the heart and plot it out as you had seen before with the global metrics, but focused on the base, mid-ventricle, and apical regions, we can run the same analysis. And what I want to highlight here is the base of the heart is really what shows us the biggest difference in terms of disease progression between all the three regions of the heart that we analyze. Similarly, if we look at the longitudinal strain, or essentially looking at changes in the length at each of the 6 different slices or rotations around the heart, we can replicate, as I said, the same analysis looking at trends over time. And once again, if we focus on the values of area under the curve, we can identify out of all these different rotations, it's really this posterior wall that shows us the greatest separation between progression in our wild types and mutants. So with all of these metrics, which are simultaneously extracted from the 4D ultrasound data, we wanted to see, is there a way that we can go one step further and leverage all of these metrics to create something that might be even more sensitive to disease? And this is where we came up with this idea for a hybrid strain index. And this came, or the crux of it is that if you plot the circumferential strain at the base against the longitudinal strain along the posterior wall, as I'd indicated, these are the 2 most sensitive metrics to cardiac dysfunction. While any of the individual metrics might not show a perfect separation between the 2 groups, we do see that there is this nice separation based on the scatter plot. And what we can do is boil down we can recharacterize these points by taking what's known as an L2 norm, essentially the magnitude of the vector from 0, 0 out to any of these points. And you can see that these lines or these magnitudes would lie perpendicular to this separating plane. And then if we take the data and calculate this hybrid strain index for every data set that's collected and similarly plot the trends over time, the interesting thing is we now have an AUC of 1, which matches that we would see in ejection fraction. So, this provided us a lot of confidence that we can take this approach and move forward. But in order to really drive home the importance of, or should I say, the utility of this hybrid strain index, we wanted to further quantify its performance. And so one of the ways that we can do that is, for example, we take the trend data where we know that there's a perfect separation between our 2 groups, but we also cannot look at the relative distribution of trends. So, how variable might we see the disease progression? And by looking at the relative ratios of the interquartile ranges between the mutants and the wild types, we get this, what we would quantify as an IQR ratio. And so, plotting the AUC values versus the IQR ratios, we can see that, while we have the circumferential strain at the base and longitudinal strain along the posterior wall, individually don't provide as good a separation as ejection fraction would, the combination of the 2 values actually produces a new metric that not only rivals that of ejection fraction in terms of separating disease progression between the 2 groups, but it also has a lower distribution within the mutant group. So we believe that this allows for us to have a lot of strong prognostic value with the hybrid strain index. But we can take this one step further and see, is there diagnostic value? And this comes down to the computation of a couple more metrics. So if we go back to these trends over time, and rather than just, qualitatively looking at the linear regression through all the points, we actually calculate a 95% confidence interval for our data and look at the separating intersection between the distributions of the wild type and controls. We get an idea that, for ejection fraction, we can separate our two groups at about just over 7 weeks old. Now, if we replicate that analysis with hybrid strain index, we actually get separation closer to just under 6 weeks, 5.72 weeks. And the beauty of this is that, this gives us some preliminary indications that we can actually have a earlier diagnostic value in the hybrid strain index. Additionally, if we were to take all of the data and we just wanted to see, okay, depending on the value that I've acquired, what is my ability to separate the healthy from diseased groups? And so if we look at ejection fraction, if we take all the individual just absolute ejection fraction metrics and compare that against the metrics that we get from hybrid strain index, this is where we really start to get differentiation between these two, where the hybrid strain index starts to perform better than ejection fraction. So boiling this also down into a scatter plot, we see that, not only do we have an improvement in prognostic value based on the hybrid strain index, we also have a improved diagnostic value. And so as I'll allude to later, the hybrid strain index could potentially have a translatable value where a lot of this data that's collected in the clinic could use this type of approach to help better characterize disease. So with that, I hope that AIM-2 has shown promise in being able to better characterize a disease progression. Now moving into AIM-3, we take a slightly different model of hypertrophy driven by energy mishandling, specifically that of the NKX25 model. And while hallmarks of this disease mimic that of the CPT2 model, where we see a increased left ventricular mass as well as a drop off in ejection fraction over time, the way that this data was collected, the study design, where at each of weeks 8, 12, and 16, we've got 6 data sets or 6 mice that are matched between the wild type and mutant groups. This allows us some further ability to further explore how we might visualize the cardiac cycle. And so to lay this out, what I'm showing here is schematics that you've already seen, looking at the base, mid-ventricle, and apical regions, as well as the 6 rotations around where we can calculate circumferential or longitudinal strain, respectively. But let's say we don't focus on any particular region, but rather look at strain as a heat map and be able to plot out any given position in the cardiac cycle, what the circumferential longitudinal information would be in a map. And so if you look in the circumferential direction, we can move from the base to the apex and use that as our y-axis. Similarly, we can look around the left ventricular endocardial border and plot that for longitudinal strain. And so putting this into motion, as you can see, we can start to quantify and produce these spatiotemporal strain maps of the cardiac function. And I'm going to have some different color maps shown later, but just to demonstrate basically the relative change in the ventricle, I use a jet color map here. And so, as I mentioned, because we have 6 data sets in both the control and in the wild type and mutant groups, and the fact that these maps are the exact same matrix size, we can actually stack them, and this allows us to perform what we consider pixel-wise spatiotemporal analysis. And so at any given point in space and time, we can compare our cohorts. So let's put this into practice. Here you're looking at an example circumferential strain map that's been averaged over the 6 mice in our control group at week 8. And like I said, if we take any point in space and time here represented by Z or T, and look specifically at cross-sectional data in our NKX mutant group, we can calculate, similar to before, an area under the curve at every single pixel. And this gives us some quantified information at how separated are our cohorts, both regionally as well as temporally. Additionally, we can look at changes over time and actually produce a aging trend where we can see different regions' response to the natural aging process. So laying this out, and I know this is a lot of information, but I kind of want to boil down the highlights here. Within our control group, we do see that there is this notable trend where the apex of the heart, this region farthest away from the AV node, actually decreases in strain value earlier on in the systolic contraction wave. And this basically indicates that we might be seeing a faster reaction to AV node stimulation just based on normal aging. And while this is matched in our mutant group, you can see that the overall contractility of the heart subsequently drops off. So even though there is that faster response that's natural, it's the mutant group is dropping off in its overall contractility at the apex. Additionally, if we look at the cross-sectional information at week 8, we can see that at the base of the heart, we're already getting very notable differences. And so this might indicate that in the systolic contraction wave, the base of the heart, even by week 8, is hindered in our mutant group. And finally, if we look at the difference in the trends, this is basically just a reflection of what you see in 1 and 2, in that the biggest, should I say, most sensitive region to the cardiac dysfunction in this NKX model seems to be a drop-off in the apical circumferential strain. Now, if we mimic, like I had mentioned, the longitudinal, or this analysis with the longitudinal strain maps, you can see a progression in the control as well as NKX mice. And just to highlight a couple of things, we noticed that in the across all, but specifically within the control mice, we noticed that there is a significantly higher contraction along the free wall than we would see in the septum, and this sort of mimics what we would expect. Especially, and then additionally, if we look at aging trends, there's this interesting phenomena where we see a decreased strain, or should I say, a increased magnitude strain earlier in the contraction cycle, whereas the peak strain seems to decrease a little bit. And effectively, what I believe this is showing is that in the longitudinal direction, there's a flattening of the contraction curve. That being said, specifically when we look at the mutant group, that overall contraction drops off over time. And if we look cross-sectionally, interesting, at week 8 and week 12, we don't really see much of a difference relatively between the two groups, but we really see this difference kick in at about week 16 between the control and mutant groups. And this might point to some nonlinear progression of disease within the NKX model. So with these demonstrated visualizations, I believe that we've been able to show that our aim 3 is achievable. And then finally, we're going to focus on some more recent work, and I'd like to point out that this has been done in collaboration with David Newton and the data science group at Purdue to apply machine learning based on all this analysis that we've done to try and improve 4D ultrasound efficiency. And so in order to reframe the work, I want to come back to the framework by which we put together this set of points that we track local wall motion. And what we want to be able to do is using the data that's inherently collected in every single 4D data set, we've got a set of radii or positional information. And on any new given data, we want to be able to predict a new position. And so this can be reflected at any given point across the cardiac cycle. And while there is a bit of math, I kind of want to just describe at a higher level what's actually being done in order to achieve this. So we take our imaging data And using what's known as principal component analysis, we can essentially compress the image information into a set of K components. And based on this sort of compressed imaging information, we can match that with a relative set of positional information that is associated at any given point in time. And then if we repeat this relationship across the entire library of information that we have available to us, we can fit a few different parameters here. I'm denoting beta and gamma, but this allows us then to plug in a new data set and then instantly predict where the new boundaries might lie. And so throughout the process, we explored 3 different models that sort of build upon each other. The first model, while the equation is provided there, I just kind of want to allude to the fact that, in this model, we're essentially taking data from every slice as an individual entity. And then we can build upon that in model 2, where we can say at any given point in time, we match the data from the full grid across all 4 slices and match that with imaging data from all 4 slices simultaneously. And we consider this a combined imaging approach. And then finally, we explore what could be a semi-automated approach where we actually provide just a single point at t is equal to 0 for a position along the endocardial boundary. And this allows us to sort of assist the algorithm to hopefully provide better performance. So just giving some numbers, and really what I want to point to here is if you look at the maps, you're going to see a progressive change over the applications from model 1, 2, and 3. And specifically here, we see with the individual slices, we can get an improvement by moving to a combined slice approach. And finally, an even better performance when we assist. And we can see that occurred based on the drop off in the mean squared error, as well as an improvement in the R squared values. So kind of making this a practical application is really going to come down to integrating it with the toolbox that I've created to analyze the 4D data. And so what I'm showing here is sort of 4 sequential slices across the heart. And right now, this is just sort of a geometric assumption of the borders. But now when we apply machine learning, in about 1.5 seconds, we can get a prediction of where all of the boundaries, both on the endocardial and epicardial boundaries would be. So this has some very nice practical applications. Now, here I'm committing a cardinal sin of presentations and providing way too much information that's too small to read. But really, this is a full compilation of all of the different metrics that we can extract out from our 4D data, as I'd shown before. And highlighted in orange is basically the values that have any significant difference if we were to compare our ground truth boundaries to that from just the predictions alone. And what this all essentially tells us is that, if we calculate all these metrics, only early diastolic strain rate showed significant differences compared to ground truth. And this provides a lot of confidence that with some further refinement, we can have a fully automated 4-dimensional ultrasound analysis, so a complete push button approach. And coming back to the thesis objectives, I hope over the course of this presentation so far, you've seen sort of a trend, and I'll place the final yes there for aim 4. And this has been a very scientifically rewarding process to go through these 4 aims and outline how we can take the concept within engineering of iterative design and go between development and application. So I know I've gone through a lot today, and I kind of want to just provide some takeaway messages here. So we've taken the 4D ultrasound imaging approach, and through some very controlled experiments, validated that against gold standard imaging. We've then created a standardized 4D ultrasound analysis that we've integrated into a standalone MATLAB toolbox. From that information, we can provide a simultaneous, comprehensive assessment of cardiac function, both looking at global volumetric measurements, local strain, as well as morphometric measurements. We've provided a we've provided a new metric, a novel metric, hybrid strain index that is shown to better characterize disease progression in a model of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And additionally, we've laid out a potentially novel approach for spatiotemporal strain mapping that can provide us some really interesting information in looking at the heartbeat in a new way. And finally, we've provided some applications with machine learning that we might then create a fully automated push-button 4D analysis approach, which could provide a lot of value to cardiac researchers. So with all of that, I've had the pleasure of working on numerous studies, but I just wanted to lay out here my journal publications over the past 5 years, actually extending back into some work I was able to do in undergrad. And one thing that I want to note here is, though I have 3 published first author papers, as well as 2 co-first author papers, one of the most unique things I've been able to do is actually publish a paper with my dad, some work that came out just last year. And that's definitely something that I have a lot of pride in, and is very unique, as I'm aware. Additionally, I have 2 patents for the work that I've showed today. One specifically looking at the 4D ultrasound analysis, but also the machine learning work that we've recently done. And additionally, I have some upcoming publications specifically focused on AIM-2 and AIM-3 with our collaborators, Dr. Jessica Ellis for AIM-2, as well as Dr. Mara Costa for AIM-3. And while this is sort of a culmination of all the work that I've done, there's a few directions that are already in motion that I would love to see this work being taken. First, we know that the heart motion is quite complex, and there's actually a component that's not included right now in the analysis, and that's myocardial rotation or twist. And so that is a additional factor that we'd like to incorporate into the analysis. Additionally, I think there's some really interesting applications with more advanced machine learning or AI techniques to further speed up the analysis process. From a practical standpoint, I'd love to continue working on distributing the toolbox for cardiovascular researchers at large. And within our own lab, we're trying to extend the applications to different disease models. And this is work presented by Dr. Sopriadna, a previous member of our lab, where he collects a lot of 4D ultrasound data with myocardial infarctions. And so this would be a great next step to take and look at a slightly different disease model. And while it has some particular applications to AIM-3 that I've provided, we can also compare a lot of these functional metrics to that of proteomics. So trying to provide a matching between the functionality and composition of the myocardium. And so with that, I will say that these are probably some of the harder slides that I've had to put together. It's come with a lot of reflection over the past several years. And so if you'll indulge me and forgive my corniness, I have a few quotes that I think just kind of fit well with some of the work that I've been able to do. I really want to thank my committee members, specifically Dr. Craig Goergen, my major advisor. All 4 of them have provided significant guidance and provided me a lot of inspiration and support over the past few years, and really helped me drive a lot of the work. I take pride in trying to be creative within my research, but they've also helped me stay grounded and make sure that a lot of my applications are very practical, and I think it reflects in the work that I've shown today. Additionally, and unfortunately, this is in no way a comprehensive list of all the people that I've had the pleasure of working with throughout my research career so far. those at Purdue and IU for really driving the last 5 years, as well as specific shout outs to Dr. Mara Costa, who's now at UCSF, but at the time of the work was at the Jackson Laboratory, as well as Dorothy Wheatcraft. Dr. Andrea Paella, who originally was at Purdue but moved to ECU and has been a great help when in regards to the CPT2 work, as well as all those members from Visual Sonics who've been a huge support over the past 5 years and really provided a lot of motivation for where my work can not only be scientifically rewarding, but also have practical applications to the wider field. I've also had the pleasure of working with some of the best lab mates I could have ever hoped for. As the PhD is this long process. There's been a lot of people that have joined and left the lab, and the one thing that I'll hold with me throughout my entire research process is how kind and supportive everyone who's come through the lab has been, and I genuinely can't wait to see all of the amazing work that they're going to be able to accomplish. Specifically, I kind of want to shout out a couple of people. Arvin and Gurneet were with me for the majority of my PhD career. They are now Dr. Supriyatna and Dr. Sangha. They've been two of my best friends throughout the years. Brett Myers, soon to be Dr. Brett Myers, fingers crossed, has been a great friend and a constant sounding board over the past few years. Finally, I'd like to thank David Sohusky, my roommate for the past 7 years. Funny enough, we figured out today that we've probably got a handful of photos together, which is kind of ironic, being roommates for the past close to a decade. So that's something that we'll need to work on. But he's been my counterpart in the MD PhD program, and we'll be going back to med school together this spring. Outside of my lab, I've really had the pleasure of taking part of a lot of additional activities throughout the past 5 years or so. I've been an experimental guinea pig for other friends. I've had the opportunity to see some of my best friends from Atlanta and Chicago get married. I've met some great people through conferences and through my work in the graduate student government. And one particular experience that I've had over the past 5 years is coaching the women's water polo team at Purdue. At times, I can imagine that they've more so put up with me than actually appreciated the coaching, but it was a really rewarding experience, and they're a really fantastic group of ladies that I'm glad to have known over the past 5 years. So I'm getting to the end here, and this is where things are going to start getting a little bit more sentimental. As my experience growing up with asthma was one that meant that I couldn't really have animals, or should I say pets. And through some allergy shots the past couple of years, I've now been able to become a proud cat dad. You see Sammy and Levi here. They've first getting into our apartment and causing havoc, but now they're really two fantastic boys, and I am really glad that I took the jump into trying to become a cat dad. And so finally, as last but certainly not least, I want to give a huge thank you to my family. They've really made me the person that I am today, and instilled in me a lot of values that I am really proud to have. Jay and Nick, you can see there on the left, and my mom, Hyunsuk and my dad, Fred, these have been they've been my rocks throughout this entire process, and I couldn't have done it without them. And as I've shown with all the other slides, I've had a quote that goes along with it, and one that my dad likes to tell me, which is one that I really hold dearly, is don't forget to smell the roses along the way. The MD PhD process is quite long, but making sure to appreciate all the little things that happen really makes it a really rewarding experience. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody for your attention. It's been wonderful to have so many of you join me today for me to showcase some of the work that I've done. And thank you from the bottom of my heart.
Thanks, Freddie. Let's everybody clap and unmute yourself too, if you're willing. Thank you. All right, that was fantastic. Questions, comments from the public? I'll hold off from the committee members, but somebody else want to chime in with questions or comments? All right, so we got a couple in the chat. Brittany, do you want to unmute and ask, or do you want us to read it from the chat?
Can you hear me, Dr. Goergen?
Yes, please.
Hi. I didn't know if my mic would work, so I posted it in here, but I'll go ahead and ask.
Perfect.
First of all, Freddie, great job. I think you did a really great work, and I think all of the stuff that you've learned working with Dr. Goergen and everybody that you've mentioned will be really great whenever you come back to clinic. And I'm really excited to see what specialty you go into if you decide to go on to residency. So my question for you is, I think this is all really great work, but thinking about a translational side of this, I was wondering if you've thought about how you do 4D scanning in patients considering the skeletal anatomy.
Sure. So first of all, thank you. I really appreciate it. For those who don't know, Brittany is a couple of my senior in the program, and so it's great to hear those words of confidence. So the really interesting thing is that a lot of this technology already exists in the clinic. The 4D imaging, specifically with ultrasound, one of the limitations that we have with small animals is that the actual hardware is sort of narrowed down based on the size of the probe. But in the clinic, we actually have access to what's called multi-array transducers. So you can actually acquire the entire 4D data set simultaneously. This is where you would see things like the 4D fetal, you see the baby's face. That's the same technology. And based on that, you can get through some of the ribs, and some of the different artifacts you would see is not as big there. But so in terms of clinical translation, and should I say, not to mention, cardiac MRI is also huge in being able to provide a lot of this information. So I think in clinical translatability, it's less so the actual imaging itself, but more so the way that we use some of the information that we can acquire from it. Specifically, if we look at the hybrid serine index, that's sort of a novel metric that I think, the data is already there in the clinic, and it's just a new way of looking at it that might have some nice applicability. And the visualization is also one that I haven't really seen in the clinic. So I think it's more so the way that we use the data that can have some really great translatability. And the nice thing is that I don't think there needs to be much more hardware development for the clinic to actually have that.
Thank you, Freddie. And I'm glad that you could utilize the multi-array transducers. And if you're interested in clinical translation, I did work with a cardiologist at St. Vincent who has specialized training in imaging beyond
Awesome.
cardiology. So let me know if you want to connect with him.
Yeah, definitely.
Brittany. Scott, you also had a question in the chat. Would you want to unmute and ask it?
Sure, Craig. So Freddie, hey, great. Thanks for inviting me. It was a pleasure to watch, and nerding out along with all the different data slides. I don't have a medical background, as you know, but I do a bunch of data work. And so I get that, like, you're capturing all this image data, and it's got all these different angles, and you mentioned that you could rotate it. And I'm wondering, is the mouse put into like a device and the system like rotates around it in like a fixed manner? Or is this more like when you go in and your wife's getting scanned and there's like this thing on somebody's arm and it's just moving around and there's no like real measurements of the position of where the device is? Like when you're computing this rotation, does the rotation need to be taken into account continuously, or do you rotate the data set initially once and then do all of your analysis on it?
Sure. So first of all, for those who don't know, Scott was my roommate in high school. We had a pleasure of going to a boarding high school, and so it's great to see Scott. So yeah, so the way that the data is collected, so I guess I want to break up the way that the data is collected and the importance of the rotations. So the way that the data is collected, we can actually strap the ultrasound probe to what's known as a 3D motor, and so the mouse basically sits statically on a stage, and we can just sort of move the probe in steps across the chest wall. And so you get this final data set that's basically a cube volume. And so the rotations really come afterwards where the data is already acquired. And so we're digitally reconstructing based on, we know where the probe is at any given point, so we can space out all of the different pixel intensities. And that allows us the ability to do the reconstruction. In the clinic, like I said, there are some hardware, there is some ultrasound hardware where we wouldn't have to worry about that. That data is already compiled together spatially. But, I think there are some really cool potential applications where you take multi-angle data and get a really nice view of the three-dimensional structures. But in terms of clinical devices, that I still need to do a little bit of research on.
Okay, so at this point you weren't considering, like, I don't know if the heart maybe rotates or something inside the body as it operates. That wasn't a consideration of this research.
Yeah, so in humans that gross motion might be a little bit more pronounced. In mice, it's
very small.
Pretty small. Yeah, so we are able to control for that pretty nicely.
Sweet. And then you mentioned that there was a clinical, like a diagnostic portion. I think it was maybe phase 2 or something. And you had the 2 different regression lines for the different kinds of data sets. Did you do any like leave one out kind of validations or something to show that was like strong relationships?
Yeah. So, and I think this might be coming to another point that I'll kind of wrap in. The progression of ejection fraction, while it does show a general decrease over time, potentially could happen non-linearly. So, the leave one out type of analysis would point towards that. But essentially, I think further work specifically with this data will need to be done to kind of identify, okay, is something like ejection fraction, is it steady until it's not? And qualitatively, we see that in the data. And that's why we do get some better performance with HSI. It doesn't stay as stable. It's this steady decrease over time. But in terms of actually trying to quantify that statistically, we'll need to do a little bit further research. But it's a great question, and it's a phenomena that there's stuff with heart failure with preserved ejection fraction is a very hot topic in cardiology. And so, it's this type of work that I would hope could point towards better approaching that.
Sweet. Awesome. Thanks for the invite and the awesome presentation.
Thanks. Appreciate it, Scott.
Thanks, Scott. Adam Wright has a question. Adam, can you unmute?
Yeah, really great work, Freddie. I had a quick question on like reproducibility. Because I know one of the downfalls of ultrasound is reproducibility in clinic. So what is that like? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, sure. So, and this is, I guess I'll talk in the 2 realms. So in the preclinical realm, the advantage of the 4D ultrasound is that as long as the volume or the actual tissue that you want to analyze is within the volume, you can reconstruct it to get the perfect view of the heart. So for someone who is a sonographer learning how to actually acquire these images, there's a lot less training involved to get the perfect view. And additionally, if you were to go back, if you figured out that you messed up on orienting the data appropriately, you can always fix it later with the 4D approach. With the 2D approach, you can't do that, right? If it's not there, it's not there. So within the clinic, I think one of the ways that they've gotten around this is when they really need to know these regional or regional kinematic information, they'll go towards tests like collecting cardiac MRI, where you do have that volumetric information. For these routine assessments, that's really where, I agree that it's known that there's a lot of misalignment between echo scans, and reproducibility is an issue. So, preclinically, 4D ultrasound has a lot of benefits there. In the clinic, I think, if we can show that there is this huge jump in value using approaches like 4D ultrasound imaging, then it'll become more commonplace as a practice, and then that can reduce a lot of that inter-user variability. It's just, it takes a lot of training, and it's not as widespread.
Great.
Awesome, thanks.
Yeah,
Thanks, Adam.
appreciate it.
Gurneet, can you ask a quick question?
Yep, great work, Freddie. It's been awesome seeing your project evolve over the past 5+ years. My question is I'm really interested in your hybrid strain index, and I was wondering, it looks like you're seeing a pathological change at an earlier time point using hybrid strain index, but what studies would you perform to confirm that you're actually seeing some sort of pathological change?
Yeah, so this is sort of an interesting problem within research, I think, is that one of the benefits of imaging is that you can look at in vivo changes in cardiac function, but if you really want to match that to confirmation that there's a disease process going on, this is something that we would like to do with proteomics, but then you're with a lot of that type of confirmation, you're sacrificing the mouse. And so what I would probably do is have something similar to the structure that I laid out with the NKX, where we've got a set of mice that are imaged at the exact same time points at several days, and then you sort of sequentially sacrifice mice to do histology or proteomics analysis to identify the biological disease mechanisms. That just takes a lot of mice, a lot of imaging, but it could be very powerful. The other thing is that you'd be focused on a very specific disease. So, you'd have to replicate that on a handful of different disease processes.
For sure. Thanks, Freddie.
Yeah, no problem.
Brett, you have a quick question?
Yeah. Hey, Freddie. Great presentation. Just had a quick question regarding validation of your methods. So I know for AIM-1, you did some validation of the 4D against CMR. Mm-hmm. And I know that CMR, at least longitudinally, provides a lower resolution than it does when you're looking at the individual slabs. So going to your strain measurements now, would validation still be done using the CMR, given the lower resolution and its effect on longitudinal, or would there be another process that would have to be involved if you were to do the validation?
So thanks for your question, and thanks for all the help over the years, Brett. So the interesting thing with CMR is that we do have the ability to run more advanced scans. So with ultrasound, we pretty much have the one modality that's based on the acoustical impedance. With the MR, you can do some more advanced scans, such as dense imaging, where you can actually get displacement information to calculate strain directly from the signals. So it's not necessarily based off the imaging itself, but it's actually acquiring the displacement information. So in that case, yes, the partial voluming effects are still possible because of the slab thickness, but we're getting a lot closer to the true biomechanics. So I think that's where the match would come in.
Great.
Okay, thanks. Yep.
Dr. Bursey from St. Louis, thanks for joining.
Hey, Freddie, great talk. I think
Hey,
everyone has said that already. I'll just echo it for however many times this is. But I just had a really quick question about sort of your data analysis. So you mentioned ultimately that you have developed or would like to develop sort of toolbox for this type of analysis. I was wondering if you could comment really quickly on how much of the analysis that you showed currently is fully standalone, and how much of it relies on some of the software that's built into like the Vivo analysis.
Sure. and maybe this is a nice, not transition, but a chance to shout out Visual Sonics, Fujifilm Visual Sonics. They have been really great partners, especially over the past couple of years. And we've created, so all of the analysis that has been provided within the talk today has come from the MATLAB software toolbox that I developed. So all of the analysis is based on that approach. So none of the analysis is basically ported from Visual Sonics or from VivoLab. The imaging is collected, we extract out or should I say we export the raw data, and then the raw data is imported into MATLAB for analysis. The toolbox itself now is a standalone application, and we're working with Visual Sonics on trying to distribute that for other people to use. So I would say that, I think in the long run, we would hope that this type of analysis is then integrated into the VivoLab software, so that you can acquire and analyze all within VSI or within VivoLab. But that is that's something that we're in works with now to figure that out. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I was just thinking in terms of like disseminating this tool around. You might need something that's not dependent on some of the more commercial software that not everyone may have access to. But it sounds like you're making those strides. So.
Yeah.
Great job.
Thank you.
Yeah, the hope is with DICOMs and a MATLAB license, you can do basically all of this offline and with your own tool sets. Yeah. Thanks, Matt. All right, well, with that, it's been a longer portion for the public as well. Everybody, please do unmute one more time and give a round of applause.
Thank you everyone for attending. It was really great to see so many people here.